G'day, ZiggyD here, and in this video I'm going to be giving you guys a rundown of the mechanics and some analysis of the new skill in the Awakening, Magma Orb. I spent a fair bit of time testing this skill and discussing with skill designer Rory from Grinding Gear Games about the mechanics of the skill, and we've pretty much sorted out, I think it is everything you'll probably want to know about this spell. At its core, Magma Orb is a fire skill, as you can probably guess from the name, and it is a projectile that bounces along, dealing area damage whenever it hits the ground. Now, it doesn't act like regular projectiles in that it doesn't actually collide with enemies. What happens instead is it travels through the air in a slow arc, and then whenever it hits the ground, it creates an area of effect explosion that then hits enemies. Only the explosion ever hits enemies. Now, what makes this skill particularly interesting and unique is that despite never hitting enemies, which is a prerequisite for the chain effect, it can still actually chain. So what happened was the developers coded the fact that it has its own built-in chaining mechanic separate to the regular chaining mechanic that sees projectiles chain when they hit an enemy. However, since Magma Orb passes through enemies or over them, it doesn't actually ever chain from an enemy itself. Instead, it just chains along the ground. So you can see as soon as that first bouncer happens, it then bounces to a second location and then fizzles out. Now, you can, of course, increase the amount of chains by adding the chain support gem. Now, what this does is you can see chains plus 2 times, so this adds plus 2 chains to the actual Magma Orb. However, this doesn't make it chain to targets, just the same as it doesn't because it never actually hits targets. Instead, what it does is it makes it continue to bounce in a line, so it adds an extra 2 bounces to the regular bounces. Now, these bounces just occur as the first bounce does, and are not affected by mobs, so I can show you guys when there are mobs nearby. Nothing actually different happens. It doesn't chain to the actual mobs. It just keeps bouncing in its same line. Now, walls and in some cases like staircases and other bits of terrain obstructions can affect the chains. Rory did say that stairs at the moment are bugging out the skill a little bit and causing it to either not chain or stack up on top of itself, but that will be likely getting fixed. Walls, however, are a little bit funny. Sometimes you can use them to your advantage, and other times they kind of screw you around. The way the chain mechanic works is that it's always going to chain at a set interval from the initial location, the initial bounce location. So you can see the first cast of the skill is targeted, basically to about half a screen length is the maximum, and that can't be affected by projectile speed. So faster projectiles doesn't increase the maximum distance that you can throw it, nor does it increase the traveling speed, and the same thing for slower projectiles. So what then happens with the chain if you cast at a wall? What will happen is sometimes the second bounce won't happen. Essentially, if there's no space for the second bounce to occur, then it will just not bounce. Nothing will actually happen. However, if you cast far enough away from the wall, the second bounce will happen, but you can see they're a lot closer together. The wall has essentially condensed the area, and this is kind of a built-in mechanic, and it means that with some clever positioning, and if you position enemies near a wall, and if you aim in the correct location, it can be very easy to get the AoEs to overlap. And AoEs can indeed overlap from multiple bounces of Magma Orb. So you can essentially shotgun. This is the term people usually use for this style of mechanic, although the shotgunning mechanic, as in the shotgunning mechanic that was removed in the Awakening, more refers to the same projectiles hitting a mob. Since this isn't actually a projectile that's hitting a mob, it's AoEs that are hitting a mob, you can still have overlapping AoEs. That occurs in many different skills like Fireball. The same thing can happen with Magma Orb. If the bouncing projectiles overlap, they can hit the same target. So if you have a target standing here, they will get hit by both of them, and the wall can help with that. You can see a particularly good example of the overlapping bouncing effect here. Any mob standing in this location, this would be basically ideal if you were trying to fight a rare or a boss that you wanted to down particularly quickly. So we've confirmed that slower and faster projectiles, or projectile speed modifiers, don't actually affect Magma Orb's bounces or its travel speed. Now, slower projectiles, however, is still a pretty good support gem, because although it has no drawback or no change to the projectile speed, it still gives you more projectile damage. Projectile damage does indeed scale Magma Orb, so things like this projectile damage down here, Ballistic Mastery, or this projectile damage over here, Sniper, will affect and scale the damage of Magma Orb. It still does projectile damage, it just doesn't have any sort of projectile travel mechanics in terms of projectile speed. So slower projectiles, decent support gem if you just want a more damage multiplier. So this is where the mechanics of the skill start to get a little more complex. The distance of the second bounce from the first is actually dictated by increase and decreases in area of effect, so your area of effect modifier. So for example, if I use increased area of effect, and just for reference, I have unspec'd out of every single AoE node on the tree on this character so as to not sort of affect the look of this skill. This is the natural Magma Orb. This is what it looks like by default. Now, if we increase the area of effect, it does two things. It increases the AoE of the actual explosion, each explosion from each bounce. So you can see the explosion here is noticeably larger with the increased AoE gem. And then what it does is it also increases a second area, and that is the area of the distance between the bounces. So what happens if I use the increased area gem? Let's fire at a particular location here. So I'm going to stand here, and I'll fire at the center of this little whatever this thing is here. You can see that bounces to just past that rock there. You can see the effect on the ground there. Now, if I were to remove increased area effect and instead substitute in concentrated effect, this should be a pretty noticeable difference here. And you can see that the bounce location is quite a substantial distance before the actual rock, so that it decreases it. Now, the way Rory phrased this in game terms is that the distance of the second bounce from the first, or each subsequent chain from the chain before it, is the area of the explosion plus 3 units, which is about the size of a player, which is the size of a small mob in a game sense. So let's view this in a more visual sense here with my lovely Photoshop demonstration. Each of these circles represents an area of effect explosion from a Magma Orb bounce, the Magma Orb bouncing in the center of the explosion, obviously. 150 pixels here on my little ruler up the top is the width of the explosion, and let's say every 10 pixels is 1 unit in game sense. So what this means is that the distance between the explosions, or between the bounces, sorry, so the distance of the bounces is as it is determined by your area of effect, is the width of an explosion. So we can represent that by putting the edge of one explosion here at the center of another explosion. So the width of an explosion brings us from the edge of this line over to the edge of this line, which just because of fancy mathematics on circles just so happens to be here, the central point of this one, because of how circles work. And then plus 3 extra units, so we can bring this guy out from 650 to 680 if we tap him across there. So this is 30 units here, 30 pixels, aka 3 units in game, which, as I mentioned earlier, is about the size of a player. Now, I don't know if that's the exact size of a player. I think that's what Rory was suggesting, which means that potentially this skill might be very difficult to actually hit players with twice with each bounce. So likely in PvP, you're only going to be able to hit a player with only one of the explosions, unless you're using a wall or something to your advantage, as shown in my earlier example. However, most of the mobs you fight against in Path of Exile are actually larger than 3 units, and many larger targets like bosses and stuff, like Kuduka, I'll be using an upcoming example, are much, much larger than 3 units. So let's represent that by our sad little friend here, Ellipse number 2. He has a sad face because he is larger than 3 units. I think he's about 6 units. And he's getting hit by both of those explosions, because although he fits perfectly in between that dead zone there, his face overlaps into each of those extra explosions, or in a game sense, his body is larger than the dead zone, therefore is going to be hit by 2 of the explosions. Now, of course, your aim has to be good, because if he is standing over here, then he's only going to be hit by 1 of the explosions, or if he's standing over here, he's only going to be hit by 1 of the explosions. You need to position the first bounce relative to your AoE somewhere before the enemy mob. Now, it doesn't take too long to get used to this. You can practice a bit on Kuduku with different AoE and AoE increases and decreases. And that's about what I did, and I got pretty good at positioning the first orb throw just before a rare or a boss to be able to get the second one to hit them, and you can tell when you're hitting them with both of them because they take a bunch of extra damage. Now I can show that with my piece of footage here of demonstrating this on Kuduku, and I was able to do this with both concentrated effect, the regular AoE of Magma Orb, and also increased area of effect to represent how it's just as possible to shotgun a mob to hit them with 2 AoEs, regardless of your area of effect, because this distance between the explosions stays the same. It's always 3 unit gap between the explosions. So because Kuduku happens to be much larger than 3 units wide, he does get hit by both of the explosions as long as you aim correctly. Now back to my beautiful photoshopping action. So this distance between the explosions is always going to stay at 3 units, and there's nothing you can do to change that by increasing or decreasing your AoE, except for if you're firing near a wall, that can have an impact on it. So while this distance stays the same, however, the width of the explosions does increase. Now what this means is that the surface area of this part of the circle just here will increase. So let's go ahead and increase the size of our ellipse 1 just here, keeping it 3 units away from the other explosion, because that's where it's always going to stay. And we can finalize that one there, and I can bring the other AoE down to approximately the same size. This is, you know, this is not science here, this is just an example. And then if we bring these guys both back up, you can see that the width of the explosion has increased. So that means that, let's say previously our ellipse sad little buddy ellipse 2 here was actually standing over here. Now he might have been not getting hit by any of the explosions, let alone 2 of them. However, as we increase the AoE, even if he was a little bit off center, he can potentially get hit by both of them because of the surface area of this edge that's closest to the other edge of the circle is going to be hitting him. Now, hopefully that explains it well, but basically what this means in a game sense is as you increase your area of effect, your shotgunning potential against multiple mobs or mobs that are slightly out of position because you have bad aim will be more likely to get hit by both of the explosions, or even just one of the explosions, essentially. So the other shotgunning related mechanic that I'd like to demonstrate here comes into play with lesser multiple projectiles and greater multiple projectiles. Now we've already established that overlapping AoEs from LMP or GMP don't affect the same mob. So if a mob's standing here, say our sad little ellipse from before was sitting here, he wouldn't be hit by both this AoE and this AoE. He would only be hit by one of those and only take 1 instance of damage. Now, of course, if he was over here, he would get hit by the red and green. Now, the rule is that this picture demonstrates quite well, is that mobs can be hit by any different colored orb. Now, obviously the colors of the orbs don't change in-game, but essentially whenever an orb bounces, each different bounce can hit the same mob. So what can happen is, let's say there's a mob standing over here, and he gets hit by the red projectile over here, red projectile number 1. But he's running really quickly, and he runs over this way and gets into this area of effect by the time it lands. So we're using chain in this instance, but we can make this simpler, and we can say he runs over to this area here, over to green projectile number 3. Now, whereas he wouldn't be able to hit by both projectile number 1 from the first bounce and projectile number 3 from the first bounce, so red 1 and red 3, he could run over into the green section and get hit by green 3, even though he was hit by red 1. So essentially, you can be hit by any one of these, any one of these, any one of these, and any one of subsequent bounces. But you can't be hit by more than one of the same tier of bounce. So that was a lot of complex shotgunning and area, distance, bounce scaling stuff. That, I promise you, it gets simpler from here on out. A lot of people ask about Knockback. It's a pretty interesting support gem with this one, and it maybe has a little bit of potential. Knockback can essentially, if we bring our example over from before, if our little sad little ellipse friend is sitting over here and gets hit by the first explosion and he gets knocked back, it can knock him into the second explosion and get hit by that. So yes, it can assist with shotgunning. So if he was not in the perfect location, your aim was slightly off, then yes, it's going to bump him into that second one and assist with shotgunning. So Knockback can add some help to shotgunning, and obviously it has defensive applications as well. However, this is just based on my experiences, but I feel like Knockback is a questionable value as a support gem slot, because against most targets where you want to shotgun, bosses and large rares and stuff like that, it's not too hard to line up shotgunning regularly, to aim in the right location. And Knockback's mostly going to help against targets that will die from just one explosion anyway, or don't really need that shotgunning bonus damage. So Knockback, potentially, if you value the defensive applications of it, then it's also going to give you a little bit of offensive bonus as well. So Knockback does have some potential. I mentioned earlier that the projectile of Magma Orb doesn't actually ever hit or connect with mobs. So as I mentioned, it technically shouldn't chain, but they coded it its own chaining mechanics, so it does chain off of ground bounces. However, it cannot fork, so it cannot fork hitting the ground, and it cannot fork hitting mobs either, because it doesn't actually, the projectile never actually collides with mobs, and that's what is required for fork. And of course, Pierce doesn't work anyway, because it already travels through mobs, it doesn't actually hit them. Both faster casting and spell echo work normally, and of course it is a spell, and as you can see, spell echo puts out 2 in rapid succession there, so these are certainly going to be, you know, frequent choices for scaling your damage dealing, your DPS with this skill. As it is a fire-based skill and deals 100% fire damage, fire penetration is obviously another great option for scaling the damage. However, added damage is actually not as bad as it could be. Now, it is 80% damage effectiveness, but because you can hit twice with it against a single target, added damage could be pretty decent. And this is actually backed up by the quality of the skill too, as a potential way you can build around it. The quality bonus is increased damage, so it doesn't have a specific type. This means that it even affects increased chaos damage, or it even increases chaos damage. So using added chaos the chaos damage will get scaled by that 20% increased damage that you can get with a 20 quality Magma Orb. So if you want to do some sort of funky added damage Magma Orb using like heralds and using added damage and maybe added chaos, then getting a quality one is definitely going to benefit you. So as you can see here, the skill does indeed work on totems, and I can also demonstrate what it looks like on a trap as well. Hell, let's go multi-trap. You can throw down some multiple traps there, and it is going to fire them out. And of course, it does work on mines as well, so we can chuck a mine down here. As awkward as mines happen to be, you can use mines for it, and obviously, you know, that will scale the damage, and Spell Totem gives you obvious totem benefits, such as increasing the range, which is probably actually a pretty significant benefit on this skill, because the default skill, as I said, fires only about half the screen, although the bounce, and if you are increasing AoE, the second bounce can go further. You can get that first one to go a lot further if you're chucking a totem down at the edge of the screen. Then it's going to be able to get an extra half screen length, basically, so you can chuck that down halfway, and then the second one can chuck down halfway as well. So you can increase the range and be a fair bit safer with Spell Totem. However, I think Totem, Traps, and Mines have some pretty inherent drawbacks with this skill, because it is a skill that requires, I think, quite a bit of player skill in terms of aiming it. The shotgunning or the AoE overlapping mechanic that I demonstrated earlier benefits aiming correctly very well. So if a mob is standing here, you really want to be aiming before mobs as much as possible. And you can do this just while clearing packs as well. If you're going to be aiming before packs, then you're going to be shotgunning some of the mobs in that pack, and you can essentially use that to give yourself a bit of bonus damage. And it also helps a lot to have excellent player positioning as you're clearing packs, in order to be able to hit all of the mobs possible and avoid any dead zones in the skill. So you really want to be able to line up those bounces, and that's something you're going to be wanting to do on the fly as well. And traps and totems just don't give you that level of control. So although totems do have a bonus in safety, can't really see traps or mines being very popular because of that lack of aiming control that you have. So guys, this has been a pretty long video. Magma Orb does have some complex and interesting mechanics. Overall, I really quite like this skill. I like that it's pretty flexible in the support gems that you can use with it, and I like that you can scale damage with things like slower projectiles without having any inherent drawbacks. What I really like about Magma Orb, though, is that it has a high skill ceiling and a high skill floor. A poorly aimed Magma Orb can deal no damage, as you essentially miss, with both of the bounces, or as you get a mob in a dead zone, or you can actually, a well-aimed Magma Orb can actually deal double damage as you hit the target twice. So I think that it's a pretty versatile skill overall, with pretty decent AoE potential and even good single target as well. So let me know what you guys think in the comments below, and if you have any further questions about the mechanics of the skill, or think that anything that I said in this video could be clarified a little bit, please feel free to let me know in the comments. That's it for now. I'm ZiggyD, and thanks for watching.